My beloved child, something changed in a conversation your soulmate never expected to have, and it began with a sentence so simple that neither of them realized how much truth was about to follow. The third party had spent so long avoiding the real explanation that even your soulmate had stopped expecting one. There had been excuses before. Different versions of the same story. Small explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but never completely answered the one question that remained quietly unresolved. Why did this person feel the need to come between the two of you in the first place? But this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no argument to win. No performance. No attempt to prove who had been right or wrong. There was simply a pause, followed by an admission your soulmate had never heard before. And strangely, the admission was not really about something you had done. It was about what your presence had awakened in someone else. Don't skip, because the most important part of this story is not that the truth was finally spoken. It is what your soulmate began remembering about you while listening to it. The third party hesitated before continuing, almost as though saying the truth aloud made it impossible to hide behind the old explanation anymore. They admitted that when your connection with your soulmate first began becoming serious, they noticed a change. Your soulmate spoke differently when your name appeared. Their mood softened. Their decisions became more thoughtful. They started questioning situations they had previously accepted without thinking very deeply about them. At first, the third party told themselves it was temporary. They assumed the connection would fade. They believed distance, confusion, or everyday life would eventually return everything to normal. Except it didn't. Your soulmate continued carrying something from the connection even during moments when you were not physically present. And that was the part the third party had never understood how to handle. Because sometimes the strongest sign that someone matters is not what happens when they are standing in the room. It is what remains after they leave it. Your soulmate remembered conversations with you days later. They reconsidered words you had spoken. They noticed how differently certain relationships felt after experiencing the quiet honesty that existed between the two of you. And slowly, without anyone deliberately trying to create a problem, the old balance around them began changing. Here is where the confession became more personal. The third party finally admitted, "I thought if you became closer to them, there wouldn't be a place for me anymore." Your soulmate said nothing. Not immediately. Because suddenly years of behavior or perhaps months of confusion looked different through that single sentence. This had not started because someone had discovered something terrible about you. It had not started because you had failed some invisible test. It had started because another person had become afraid of losing their importance. And fear, when it is never spoken honestly, can disguise itself as advice. It can sound like concern. It can appear as endless questions. Are you sure about them? Are you moving too quickly? What if you regret this? What if you don't really know them? One question by itself can be reasonable. But your soulmate now realized how often those questions had appeared precisely when the connection between you was becoming clearer. Stay till the end, because this realization did not instantly make your soulmate angry. What happened was quieter than that. They began looking backward. They remembered moments when they had almost reached out to you and then changed their mind after a conversation with this person. They remembered times when something innocent you said had been interpreted for them in the least generous way. They remembered being encouraged to wait whenever they felt ready to become more honest with you. And perhaps the strangest realization was this: the third party never actually needed your soulmate to stop caring about you completely. They only needed them to keep doubting themselves long enough that nothing moved forward. That difference mattered. Your soulmate lowered their eyes for a moment and asked the question the third party had probably hoped would never come. Why didn't you just tell me you were afraid of losing me? Silence. Not dramatic silence. Human silence. The kind that appears when someone finally reaches the sentence underneath every other sentence. The third party admitted they had not known how. Saying, "I'm worried your life is changing and I don't know where I fit anymore," would have required vulnerability. It was easier to focus on you. Easier to find flaws. Easier to create questions about the connection than to admit that the real uncertainty existed inside them. And there is something important waiting for you here, because your soulmate began seeing another side of the story at the exact same moment. They remembered you never demanding that they abandon anyone. You had never asked them to erase their history. You were not trying to take somebody's place. What you wanted, sometimes without even saying it directly, was simply a relationship where neither person had to become smaller to keep everyone else comfortable. That memory landed differently now. Your soulmate remembered an ordinary moment, something the third party could never have known meant so much. Perhaps it was a conversation in which you listened without interrupting. Perhaps it was the way you respected a boundary instead of pushing against it. Perhaps it was one of those tiny moments that would look meaningless from the outside but stays with someone because of how safe and understood they felt inside it. Your soulmate realized that the very qualities they had been encouraged to question were the qualities they had quietly missed. Your patience. Your steadiness. The way you did not force answers when they were still learning how to speak honestly. And then another truth emerged. The third party admitted that there had been one particular moment when everything changed for them. Your soulmate had defended you when you were not there. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. They had simply corrected something unfair that had been said about you. "That isn't who they are," your soulmate had responded. The third party remembered the certainty in their voice. Until that moment, they had assumed your connection could still be influenced from the outside. But hearing your soulmate protect your character when there was nothing to gain from doing so made them understand something uncomfortable. This was deeper than convenience. Your soulmate had formed their own understanding of you. And that could not be controlled by someone else's opinion forever. What happened next surprised even the third party. Your soulmate did not immediately accuse them. Instead, they asked, "Did you ever actually dislike them?" Another pause. Then came the answer, "Not in the beginning." That sentence changed the entire emotional shape of the conversation. Because the third party explained that their feelings toward you had grown more complicated only after noticing how naturally your soulmate became themselves around you. You were not competing. Yet your presence highlighted things that had been ignored. When your soulmate felt heard by you, they noticed where they had not felt heard elsewhere. When they felt respected by you, they became more aware of situations where their choices were constantly questioned. When they experienced calm with you, chaos elsewhere became harder to call normal. None of this meant you were perfect. Your soulmate knew that. You had misunderstandings. You had moments where both of you could have communicated better. But the third party's admission allowed your soulmate to separate your genuine imperfections from the story that had slowly been built around them. And that distinction was enormous. Because there is a difference between seeing someone clearly and seeing them through somebody else's fear. For the first time in a long while, your soulmate was beginning to separate the two. Then the conversation softened. The third party admitted something your soulmate was not prepared to hear. I knew you cared about them more than you were admitting. Your soulmate looked up. The words were not spoken as an accusation anymore. They sounded almost tired, almost relieved to stop pretending. The third party said they had noticed every time your soulmate went quiet when your name was mentioned. They noticed when they reread old messages. They noticed when somebody casually brought you up and your soulmate tried too hard to appear unaffected. They noticed the way certain songs, places, and ordinary details pulled your soulmate into thought. And eventually the third party understood that keeping two people apart did not necessarily remove the feelings underneath. Sometimes it only makes those feelings quieter. Your soulmate sat with that for a long moment. Because suddenly the person who had created so much uncertainty was acknowledging the very thing your soulmate had struggled to admit even to themselves. You still mattered. Not because somebody promised a perfect future. Not because every complicated moment disappeared. You mattered because the connection had left something genuine behind. Something that survived opinions, distance, hesitation, and time. But there was still one question your soulmate needed answered. One detail the third party had carefully avoided throughout the entire conversation. Your soulmate finally asked, was there one specific thing you said about them that you knew wasn't completely true? The third party's expression changed. And this is where the confession stopped being about general insecurity and moved toward something far more specific. Because there had been a particular conversation. A moment your soulmate remembered clearly. A moment that influenced one of the biggest decisions they made about you. For a long time, they believed the third party had simply misunderstood what happened. But now, sitting across from them, your soulmate realized there might have been more to it. The third party took a slow breath and said, there is something about that day I never told you. Your soulmate became completely still. Not because they expected something frightening, but because they suddenly understood that the missing piece had been sitting inside one ordinary memory all along. And what the third party was about to explain would force your soulmate to revisit the exact moment they first began pulling away from you, because the truth behind that moment was nothing like the version they had carried all this time. For several seconds, your soulmate did not ask another question, because something in the third party's face had already answered part of it. This was no longer a conversation about different opinions. It was about a moment that had quietly redirected everything between you, and your soulmate could feel that the truth was finally approaching the surface. The third party looked down and admitted that the day your soulmate began pulling away from you had not happened exactly the way they had described it. There had been a conversation about you, yes. There had been uncertainty, yes. But one important detail had been left out. Your soulmate had been told that you were becoming distant because your feelings had changed. They had been told that your silence meant you were losing interest, that your hesitation meant you were reconsidering the connection, that perhaps you were already preparing yourself to move on. At the time, your soulmate had been vulnerable enough to believe it. They remembered staring at their phone, seeing your name, wanting to reach out, and then stopping because those words were still echoing in their mind. What if the third party was right? What if contacting you only made them look foolish? What if you had already emotionally stepped away and they were the only one still holding on? But now the third party finally admitted something that changed the meaning of that entire memory. They had known there was another explanation for your distance. They knew you had been trying to give your soulmate space. They knew you had said something very different from what was eventually repeated. Your message had not been, "I don't care anymore." It had been closer to, "I don't want to pressure them. If they need time, I'll respect that." Your soulmate's expression changed instantly. Not because the sentence itself was dramatic, but because it sounded exactly like something you would say. It matched the person they remembered. It matched the way you had handled difficult moments before. And suddenly a question appeared that neither of them could avoid. Why had that part been removed? The third party answered quietly. Because I knew if I told you exactly what they said, you would go back. Don't skip, because this was the moment your soulmate stopped looking at the past through emotion and began looking at it through clarity. They remembered how close they had been to reaching out. They remembered writing a message, deleting it, writing another one, then putting the phone away. They remembered convincing themselves that silence was dignity when, deep down, what they actually wanted was one honest conversation with you. And now they were learning that you might have been sitting somewhere else doing almost the same thing, waiting, respecting, wondering, believing that giving them room was the kindest choice you could make. Two people had been trying not to pressure each other while someone between them interpreted that silence as evidence that the connection was fading. Your soulmate leaned back, processing everything, and for the first time the third party did not interrupt. There was nothing left to defend. The truth had already begun rearranging old memories on its own. Then your soulmate asked, "Did they ever say they wanted to leave me?" The answer came quickly this time. No. Did they ever say they stopped caring? Another pause. No. Did they ever tell you they were looking for somebody else? No. Your soulmate looked away. Something about those three answers carried more weight than 100 explanations. Because for so long, they had emotionally reacted to things you had never actually said. They had made decisions based on interpretations instead of conversations. And what hurt most was not that someone else had influenced them. It was realizing how easily uncertainty had filled the space where direct communication should have been. Stay till the end, because your soulmate's next realization was not about blaming the third party. It was about taking responsibility for their own silence. They could have asked you. They could have sent the message. They could have said, "I heard something, and I need to know if it is true." Instead, they had allowed pride, hesitation, and outside opinions to answer a question that belonged only between the two of you. That understanding softened something inside them. Strange as it may sound, the truth did not only make them look differently at the third party. It made them look differently at themselves. They remembered all the times you tried to communicate gently, even when you were unsure what they were feeling. They remembered moments when you left a door open instead of closing it. They remembered one conversation in particular when you said that you would rather hear an uncomfortable truth directly than live inside assumptions. At the time, your soulmate had not understood how important those words would become. Now they did. The third party finally said, "I thought I was protecting you from getting hurt." Your soulmate turned toward them. There was no anger in their response, only a question. Or were you protecting yourself from something changing? That question seemed to reach somewhere deeper. The third party did not answer immediately. Then they admitted that maybe it had been both. They had been afraid that your soulmate would become less available. Afraid traditions would change. Afraid conversations would change. Afraid they would no longer be the first person your soulmate turned to when something important happened. And somewhere inside that fear, they convinced themselves that interfering was the same as protecting. But those were not the same thing, and now they knew it. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate did not respond with cruelty. They said something surprisingly calm. "You could have told me you were scared. I might have understood." The third party's eyes softened. Perhaps that was the sentence they needed to hear years ago. Perhaps it was the sentence they had never known how to ask for. And suddenly the conversation became less about villains and more about choices people make when they do not know how to express what they are really feeling. That did not erase what happened. It did not make every decision acceptable. But it did reveal something more human beneath the conflict. Your soulmate could finally see that the third party had not entered the situation carrying some mysterious knowledge about you. They had entered it carrying insecurity about themselves. And that distinction mattered, because your soulmate had spent too long wondering whether there had been something wrong with you that everyone else could somehow see except them. Now they understood the opposite. In many ways, the problem had started because other people could see how meaningful the connection was becoming before your soulmate had even admitted it to themselves. Then another memory returned. Your soulmate remembered one evening when you had both been talking about the future in an ordinary, almost casual way. Nothing dramatic had been promised. You had simply mentioned something you wanted to experience someday, a place, a quiet home, a shared tradition, perhaps even something as simple as cooking dinner together after a long day. Your soulmate had laughed at the time, but later they had replayed the moment privately because something about it felt natural. The third party had noticed that change. They had noticed your soulmate beginning to imagine you not only as someone they cared about in the present, but as someone who could belong in the shape of their future. That was when their fear increased. "I thought once you started imagining a life with them, I wouldn't be able to change your mind," the third party confessed. Your soulmate's reply was almost a whisper. "Maybe you were never supposed to change my mind." Silence settled again, but this silence felt different. It was no longer hiding anything. It was allowing truth to breathe. Your soulmate realized that love, friendship, family, and loyalty were never meant to be a competition where one person's importance required another person's removal. Healthy connection expands. It makes room. It does not demand that someone erase every other meaningful bond to prove devotion. You had understood that more clearly than anyone had given you credit for. That was why you had never asked your soulmate to choose sides. You had wanted them to choose honesty. There is a difference. And now, perhaps much later than either of you would have wished, your soulmate was finally understanding it. But then the third party said something unexpected. "There is another reason I finally told you all of this. Your soulmate looked up. Until that moment, they had assumed the confession had happened because guilt had become too heavy or because time had softened old defensiveness. But there was more. Something recent had happened. Something small enough that nobody else would have noticed, yet powerful enough to make the third party reconsider everything. Your soulmate asked what it was. The third party reached for their phone, hesitated, and placed it on the table. A few days ago, they said, I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Your soulmate's expression tightened with curiosity. About them? The third party nodded. And here is where the conversation shifted again, because what they had seen was not a secret romance, not a dramatic revelation, and not anything designed to create chaos. It was something far quieter. Something that made the third party realize that even after everything, even after distance, even after misunderstanding, your feelings had never become what they had once claimed they were. They had come across a message connected to you. Not a message you sent to interfere. Not a message demanding anything from your soulmate. It was something you had written much earlier and never expected your soulmate to read. A few lines about why you had chosen to step back. And the third party admitted that after reading those words, they finally understood how badly they had misunderstood your silence. You had not stepped away because you stopped caring. You had stepped away because you cared enough not to force yourself into a place where you were no longer sure you were wanted. You had written that you hoped your soulmate found peace, even if that peace did not include you. You had written that part of loving someone sometimes meant respecting the answer you believed their silence was giving you. And then there was one final line. A line the third party had read more than once because it made every old assumption feel suddenly uncomfortable. Your soulmate leaned forward and asked, "What did they write?" The third party stared at the phone for a moment, then looked directly at them and said, "That is the part one think you need to see for yourself." And as the phone slowly moved across the table toward your soulmate, they had no idea that the words waiting on that screen would reveal not only what you had truly felt back then, but why the third party had finally decided that keeping you apart was something they could no longer justify. The moment your soulmate took the phone into their hands, the entire conversation seemed to become quieter than it had been before, because suddenly this was no longer about what someone remembered saying or what someone believed had happened. Your own words were sitting there. Untouched. Written at a time when you had no idea they would ever be seen by the person they were about. Your soulmate looked at the screen for several seconds before reading. Perhaps part of them already sensed that whatever was waiting there would force them to question something they had carried for far too long. And when their eyes finally moved across the first line, they stopped. Not because the words were dramatic. Because they were gentle. You had written about trying to understand their silence without turning it into resentment. You had written that you did not know whether they needed space, whether they had changed their mind, or whether life had simply become too complicated for them to explain. And instead of accusing them, you had chosen to believe there might be something happening inside them that you could not see. Your soulmate swallowed slowly. The third party remained silent. There was no reason to explain anything now. Your words were doing something explanations could not. They were taking your soulmate back to a version of the past they had never been allowed to see. Don't skip, because the line that changed the atmosphere was not the one your soulmate expected. You had written, "I keep wondering if reaching out again would bring them comfort or only make things harder." Your soulmate read it twice. Then a third time. That single sentence touched the exact place where the misunderstanding had lived. While they had been believing that your silence meant indifference, you had been worrying that your presence might feel like pressure. While they were being told you had emotionally moved on, you had been quietly measuring every decision against one question: what would be kindest for them? Your soulmate lowered the phone for a moment. Something in their expression shifted. They were beginning to understand how two people could care about each other deeply and still become separated when neither of them felt safe enough to ask the simplest question directly. "Why didn't I ever see this?" they asked. The third party answered carefully. "Because I didn't want you to." No excuse followed. No attempt to soften it. Just an answer. And strangely, that honesty mattered. Your soulmate looked back at the screen. There was more. You had written that you missed the ordinary things most. Not some perfect version of the relationship. Not some imagined grand future. The ordinary things. A certain way they laughed when they forgot to be guarded. The moments when conversations lasted longer than either of you intended. The way silence between you could sometimes feel comfortable instead of awkward. You missed being able to tell them something small without wondering whether you were crossing an invisible line. And then you had written something even more revealing: "I don't want them to remember me as someone who made their life harder." Your soulmate's eyes stayed on that sentence. Because they had spent so much time thinking you had left because the connection was not important enough to fight for. Now they were seeing the opposite possibility. Maybe you had stepped back because the connection was important enough that you refused to turn it into a battle. That realization carried a strange kind of weight. There are moments when a person does not discover something completely new. They finally find the missing explanation for something their heart had quietly suspected all along. This was one of those moments. Your soulmate remembered the final conversations between you. You had been softer than they expected. You had not tried to make them feel guilty. You had not demanded immediate answers. You had simply become quieter. At the time, they interpreted that quietness as detachment. Now they could see another meaning. You had been trying to leave with dignity instead of creating another wound. Stay till the end, because the third party had not yet shown your soulmate the line that changed their own mind. They pointed toward the bottom of the message and said, "Read the last part." Your soulmate scrolled. Their eyes slowed as they reached it. You had written, "If one day they understand that I never wanted to take anything away from their life, I hope they also understand that I was only trying to bring something honest into it." Your soulmate became completely still. There it was. The truth at the center of everything. You had never wanted to replace anyone. You had never wanted to separate them from the people they loved. You had not been trying to win some invisible competition. You simply wanted a connection where what existed between the two of you could be allowed to exist without being constantly measured against someone else's fear. Your soulmate looked toward the third party and asked, "This is why you told me?" The third party nodded. "Partly." That word opened another door. Partly. There was still more. Something important is waiting for you here, because the third party then admitted that seeing your message had forced them to remember something they themselves had tried to forget. Long ago, before the distance became permanent, you had actually spoken to them directly. It had been brief, respectful, almost forgettable on the surface. But you had said something they now understood differently. You had told them, "I'm not here to take your place." At the time, they had dismissed it. They assumed you were simply saying what sounded good. But now, after seeing everything that had happened afterward, they realized your actions had matched those words. Even when your soulmate pulled away, you did not retaliate. Even when assumptions about you spread, you did not try to embarrass anyone. Even when you could have pushed your soulmate to choose between people, you did not. The third party finally admitted, "I kept waiting for you to become the person I had convinced myself you were. You never did." Your soulmate looked at them carefully. "Then why continue?" The answer came slowly. Because by that point, admitting they had been wrong would have required admitting that much of the tension had been unnecessary. And sometimes people hold on to a story not because it is true, but because they have invested so much emotion into it that letting go feels like admitting something difficult about themselves. The third party said that every month that passed made the truth harder to tell. Every time your soulmate mentioned you, they had an opportunity to correct the past, and every time they delayed, the correction became more uncomfortable. Until eventually they started hoping the entire situation would simply disappear. But feelings do not always disappear because people stop discussing them. Memories do not automatically lose meaning because time moves forward. And your soulmate had never completely stopped wondering. That was something the third party had noticed. They had seen the way your soulmate occasionally became distant after hearing something that reminded them of you. They had noticed that your soulmate never spoke badly about you, even when it would have been easier to justify their own decision by doing so. They had noticed that whenever someone asked why things ended, your soulmate gave vague answers rather than criticizing you. And perhaps most revealing of all, they had noticed that your soulmate still protected certain memories. Small private moments. Things they refused to let anyone make cynical. Your soulmate had never fully closed the emotional meaning of what happened. They had only stopped touching it because they thought the answer had already been decided. Now the answer was beginning to look unfinished. Then something remarkable happened. Your soulmate did not immediately ask how to reach you. They did not suddenly turn the moment into a dramatic plan. Instead, they asked something quieter: "Did they ever know what you told me?" The third party shook their head. "No." "So they thought I pulled away because I wanted to?" Another nod. Your soulmate looked down at the message again, and the expression on their face softened in a way the third party had not seen for a long time. Because now they were imagining your side of those final days. You waiting. You trying not to intrude. You probably telling yourself that if they wanted to speak, they knew how to find you. You accepting an answer they had never actually intended to give. And your soulmate began to understand something about silence that they had never understood before. Silence can mean many things, but when two people are afraid, they often choose the interpretation that protects them from rejection rather than the one that invites honesty. Your soulmate had told themselves you did not care because that was easier than risking a message and discovering whether you still did. You had told yourself they wanted distance because that was easier than risking becoming unwanted. And between those two assumptions, an entire relationship had been left unfinished. The third party watched your soulmate carefully and said, "There's something else you should know. Your soulmate almost smiled at the sentence, though there was sadness underneath it. There always seems to be. But this next detail was different. The third party explained that shortly after the two of you became distant, your soulmate had once asked them a question late at night. "Do you think I made the right choice?" The third party remembered answering immediately, "Yes." At the time, your soulmate had nodded and let the conversation end. But what the third party never revealed was that afterward, they had felt uncertain. Not because they suddenly understood everything, but because your soulmate did not look relieved. They looked like someone trying very hard to accept an answer that did not match what they felt. "I knew then that you weren't finished with them," the third party admitted. "I just didn't want to admit what that meant." Your soulmate's eyes lifted. What did it mean? The third party said, that maybe the problem was never the connection. Maybe the problem was how much everyone else was trying to define it for you. Those words landed differently. Your soulmate had spent so long asking whether the relationship with you had been strong enough. Now they wondered whether that had ever been the correct question. Maybe the connection had been meaningful precisely because it survived so much confusion without turning completely bitter. Maybe the fact that neither of you could easily reduce the other person into a villain meant something. Maybe what remained was not proof that you were destined for some perfect ending, but evidence that the story had never received the honest conversation it deserved. That difference kept everything grounded. Your soulmate was not imagining that one confession could erase years of distance or instantly repair everything. They understood that people change. Circumstances change. Feelings evolve. But they also understood that truth matters even when it arrives late. Sometimes closure means goodbye. Sometimes it means forgiveness. And sometimes closure reveals that the door was never actually closed by either person, it was simply left untouched because both believed the other had shut it first. Your soulmate placed the phone on the table and asked the third party a question they had not expected. "Why now?" The third party thought carefully. "Because I realized I was still making decisions for you even after everything ended. I was still deciding what you should know." That answer brought a quiet understanding into the room. The confession was not only about you. It was about giving your soulmate back something that had been taken from them without anyone noticing, the ability to interpret their own relationship. The third party said, "Whatever you do after this, I don't want it to be because of me." Your soulmate nodded slowly. That was perhaps the healthiest sentence anyone had spoken all evening. No instructions. No pushing. No attempt to swing the situation in the opposite direction. Just space. For the first time, your soulmate was being allowed to consider you without somebody else standing between the memory and its meaning. And once that space appeared, something unexpected came into focus. They remembered your last real conversation. There had been a moment near the end when you almost said something, then stopped. Your soulmate had noticed it even then. They had asked, "What?" You had smiled faintly and said, "Nothing. It's okay." For years, that moment had lived somewhere in the back of their mind. Now they wondered what you had been about to say. Had you been about to ask whether they wanted you to stay? Had you been about to tell them you were confused? Had you been trying to explain that you were stepping back only because you believed that was what they needed? Your soulmate would never know unless the question was finally allowed to exist. And that is where something inside them changed, not into certainty, but into courage. There is a beautiful difference between those two things. Certainty demands that you know what will happen. Courage only asks whether the truth is worth approaching even when you do not know the outcome. Your soulmate was beginning to realize they did not need a guarantee from you. They did not need to know whether everything could be restored. They simply needed to stop allowing an old misunderstanding to remain the final word between two people who had once meant something real to each other. But just as your soulmate began considering what an honest conversation with you might look like, the third party reached for the phone again. "There's one more thing in that message," they said. Your soulmate looked confused. They had already read to the end. "No," the third party explained, "not in the part one showed you. There had been another page attached. Something written later. Something the third party had hesitated to reveal because it was more personal than everything else." Your soulmate's heartbeat seemed to slow as the screen changed. At the top was a date. Months after the two of you had stopped speaking. Long enough that your soulmate had assumed you had already forgotten the connection. And beneath that date was a sentence that instantly changed the expression on their face. You had written about the one thing you would say if you ever had the chance to speak to them again, not to win them back, not to reopen old conflict, but simply because you never wanted them to carry the wrong understanding of why you disappeared. Your soulmate read the first few words, stopped, and looked toward the third party. "You read this too?" The third party nodded. "That was the part that made me come here." And as your soulmate returned their eyes to the screen, they had no idea that what you had written next would answer the question they had secretly carried longer than any other. If you had been given one final honest moment with them, what would you have wanted them to know? What your soulmate read next was not a request for another chance. It was not an attempt to pull them backward. And somehow, that made every word feel even more meaningful. You had written, "If I ever speak to them again, I don't want the first thing they hear from me to be about what went wrong. I want them to know I never regretted caring about them." Your soulmate stopped there. The third party watched quietly as those words settled into the space between them. For so long, your soulmate had assumed the ending must have changed the meaning of everything that came before it. They believed distance meant the connection had become a mistake in your mind. They imagined you looking back with disappointment, perhaps wishing you had never become so emotionally invested. Yet here you were, writing months later with no audience, no guarantee they would ever see it, and saying the opposite. You did not regret caring. You regretted the confusion. You regretted the things left unsaid. But the affection itself had never become something you needed to erase. Don't skip, because the next lines were where your soulmate finally began seeing the difference between losing a connection and losing its meaning. You had written that some people enter our lives and remain important even when the relationship changes shape. You had learned not to measure everything by whether it lasted exactly as you once imagined. Sometimes a person can matter because they helped you discover something honest about yourself. Sometimes they leave you with a standard for how deeply you want to communicate, how carefully you want to love, how courageously you want to show up next time. And then you wrote, "They taught me that silence can protect you for a moment, but truth is what gives you peace." Your soulmate read that sentence slowly. It almost felt as if the words were speaking directly into the room where they sat now. Because that was exactly what this entire conversation had become. Silence had protected everyone temporarily. The third party had avoided admitting their insecurity. Your soulmate had avoided risking rejection. You had avoided becoming a source of pressure. Everyone had chosen silence for reasons that once seemed understandable. And yet all of those small silences had eventually created a story none of you had actually chosen. Your soulmate looked at the third party and said, "We were all trying to protect ourselves." The third party nodded. Yes. There was no victory in that realization. Only clarity. And clarity can be gentler than blame because it allows people to understand what happened without pretending that nobody made mistakes. Your soulmate kept reading. You had written about one memory you still carried the last time your soulmate looked completely relaxed around you. You remembered where you were. You remembered something insignificant they said. You even remembered the expression on their face because, in that moment, they were not worried about opinions, timing, expectations, or what anyone else might think. They were simply themselves. You wrote, "That is the version of them I hope they never lose." Your soulmate's eyes remained fixed on the screen. They knew exactly which moment you meant. They remembered it too. And suddenly the past did not feel like one long story of separation. It felt like a collection of real moments that still belonged to both of you, regardless of what happened afterward. Stay till the end, because this is where the third party finally revealed the reason they could no longer keep the truth hidden. They had read those words and expected to find bitterness somewhere. They expected at least one sentence blaming your soulmate, blaming them, blaming the circumstances. Instead, they found something that made them uncomfortable in a completely different way. You had taken responsibility for your own part. You wrote that perhaps you should have asked more directly what your soulmate wanted instead of interpreting silence. You admitted that stepping back had seemed respectful, but maybe respect and honest communication should have existed together. You wondered whether you had been too quick to accept an ending that nobody clearly expressed. And then you wrote something that the third party could not forget: "Maybe we were both waiting for the other person to be brave first." That sentence stayed with them. Because they suddenly realized their influence had mattered only because both of you were already uncertain enough to let outside voices fill the gaps. That did not excuse what they had done. But it revealed something important about the future. If you and your soulmate ever spoke again, repeating the old pattern would not help either of you. The answer was not to simply reverse every decision and pretend nothing happened. The answer would have to be directness. Two people speaking for themselves. Two people asking instead of assuming. Two people allowing each other to answer without someone else interpreting the meaning. Your soulmate finally reached the final paragraph. They took a slow breath and continued. You had written, "If they are happy now, I hope nothing I ever say disturbs that. But if they ever wonder whether what we had mattered to me, I hope somehow they know the answer was always yes." Your soulmate closed their eyes for a moment. Nothing in the room moved. That was the line. Not a declaration demanding a response. Not a promise that the future had already been decided. Just a truth you had carried privately. It mattered. They mattered. The connection mattered. And sometimes that is the sentence people need most, not, "Come back," not, "Choose me," but simply, "What we shared was real to me too." Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate's next question revealed that they had already changed in a way even the third party had not anticipated. They asked, "When did you find this?" The third party told them. It had been several days earlier. "And you waited this long to tell me?" Your soulmate asked. The third party nodded, but this time there was a reason. They had spent those days asking themselves whether showing the message was simply another form of interference. They did not want to repeat the same mistake by pushing your soulmate toward you now after once pushing them away. So they had almost said nothing. Then they realized that withholding the truth again would still be making the decision for your soulmate. The only fair choice was to give them the information and then step out of the way. Your soulmate looked at them differently after hearing that. There was still disappointment. Trust does not instantly return because one honest conversation happens. But there was also something new: acknowledgement. The third party was finally doing what they should have done from the beginning, allowing your soulmate to decide for themselves. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything tonight," the third party said. "I just don't want you building the rest of your life around something that wasn't completely true." That sentence became another turning point. Your soulmate realized how much of their emotional story had been built around an assumption: you had chosen to stop caring. Once that assumption disappeared, they did not suddenly know what came next. But they knew what could no longer remain unchanged. They could not continue pretending they had no questions. They could not keep telling themselves the past had been simple. They could not continue avoiding your memory just because someone else once taught them how to interpret it. And perhaps most importantly, they could no longer blame circumstances for every choice they themselves had made. This was where their growth truly began. They understood that the third party had influenced them, but they had still participated in the silence. They had accepted answers without asking you. They had allowed someone else's confidence to become stronger than their own curiosity. And now, rather than using that realization to punish themselves, they saw it as a lesson. If there was ever another conversation with you, they wanted to enter it differently. Not as someone demanding explanations. Not as someone trying to force the past back into existence. But as someone willing to say, "I think we misunderstood each other, and I would like to hear your side directly." There was something quietly powerful about that possibility because it required no fantasy. No promise. No certainty. Just honesty. The third party stood as though they sensed the conversation had reached its natural end. But your soulmate stopped them with one last question. "If you could go back to the beginning, what would you do differently?" The third party thought for a long moment. "I would tell you how I felt about losing my place in your life instead of convincing you there was something wrong with them." Your soulmate nodded. It was the answer they needed. Not because it repaired everything, but because it finally named the real issue without disguise. The third party had not come between you because they possessed some hidden truth about you. They came between you because they were afraid of change. Afraid of becoming less important. Afraid that your soulmate's world was expanding in a direction they could not control. And once that fear was finally spoken clearly, much of the mystery disappeared. The story became human again. Complicated, imperfect, but understandable. Your soulmate watched them leave and remained alone with the phone on the table. And this is where the most intimate part of the story began. Because without the third party in the room, without anyone explaining what you meant, your soulmate opened the message one more time. They went back to the beginning. They read every line slowly. But this time they were not searching for proof that you still cared. They were searching for all the moments where they themselves had misunderstood you. And one small detail suddenly stood out. Near the bottom of the message, you had mentioned something your soulmate had completely forgotten. You wrote about a promise you once made to each other, not some enormous promise about forever, but something smaller. Something almost playful. You had both said that no matter how complicated life became, if there was ever something truly important to say, you would try to say it directly rather than allowing other people to carry the message. Your soulmate remembered laughing when that promise was made because at the time it seemed unnecessary. Of course you would talk directly. Why wouldn't you? Yet somehow that was exactly what neither of you had done when things became difficult. And now, years or months later, that old promise felt less like a memory and more like an invitation to finally become the people you once believed you already were. Your soulmate reached for their own phone. Their fingers hovered above your name. And there it was, the same hesitation that had stopped them so many times before. What if too much time had passed? What if you had changed? What if reopening communication would only create confusion? Those were real questions, and this time your soulmate refused to pretend otherwise. But another question appeared beside them. What if one respectful, honest message could finally give both of you the truth you had missed the first time? They did not type immediately. Instead, your soulmate opened the old conversations between you. They scrolled slowly, almost cautiously, as though walking through a room they had not entered in years. And something surprised them. The final messages were not cold. Not really. They were careful. Almost too careful. Both of you were speaking like people who cared but were afraid to show too much. Your soulmate found the last message you ever sent. It was short. So short that they had once treated it as proof you were finished. But now the words looked completely different. You had said, "Take the time you need. I'll understand." Back then, your soulmate heard goodbye. Now they heard patience. And suddenly they wondered whether you had spent all this time believing their lack of response was the answer. Your soulmate stared at those words for a long time. Then something even more unexpected happened. They scrolled farther upward and found a voice message from you they had never opened. The timestamp was from the exact week everything changed. Your soulmate froze. They remembered seeing it back then, but the third party had just finished telling them not to complicate things, and they had convinced themselves listening would only make moving on harder. So they left it untouched. And somehow, through every phone update, every archived conversation, every attempt to move forward, that voice message had remained there. Unheard. Waiting. Your soulmate placed their thumb over it but did not press play. Not yet. Because suddenly they understood that this might be the closest thing they had to hearing your voice from the exact moment when everything was misunderstood. Whatever you said in that recording had been spoken before distance had rewritten the story. Before silence became an answer. before either of you knew how long the separation would last. Your soulmate sat very still, staring at the small play symbol, realizing that the truth they had been searching for all evening might have been waiting in their own phone the entire time. And when they finally pressed it, the first words they heard from you made them understand why that message had never been meant as a goodbye at all.